Yeah, so we thought it would be helpful to talk about the fact that CDC has supported a number of countries in integrating an etiology of anemia kind of analysis into existing national micronutrient surveys or panel surveys. And so just talking a little bit about that experience. So I thought I would just focus on a couple of topics. So these are the four that I'm going to talk about, probably interweaving a few things inadvertently as well. But really, this is about scenarios where we're providing technical, in fact, our team is providing technical assistance to countries to do either a national micronutrient survey or, some kind of, like longitudinal panel survey, those kinds of things, and integrating this information into it. So first, just population groups. Usually when we have been requested to do this, one of the main areas are women, 15 to 49 years of age. Typically we've been without an option, because it's a population-based household survey, we really have to focus on non-pregnant women, just because it's very hard to get enough pregnant women to do modeling in a household population-based survey context. Importantly, risk does vary by age, whether you're pregnant or non-pregnant, so that's just something to keep in mind. A lot of times with the way the modeling and the approach is done and the data collection is done and the cost, we're forced to put everyone together. But obviously your risk as an adolescent pregnant person or a non-pregnant person versus someone who's in their 40s is going to be different. We have worked up some protocols to look at etiology for pregnant women, but not in a household population-based survey setting. That was really through ANC clinics. And as I mentioned in the previous conversation, we all know that risk of anemia, risk of a lot of the different risk factors varies by pregnancy, gestational age. So trimester is really critical for this. And that's just something to keep in mind if you ever do think about trying to look at this among pregnant women, that really, your risks in the third trimester are and the causes are fundamentally different than the first trimester potentially. And then also what we've been asked to do then is for children 6 to 59 months. I will say then we have the same issue. The risk of micronutrient deficiencies is higher and the immunity is lower among children 6 to 23 months versus the older children. So I think just as a practical level, keeping that in mind. And at the same time, it's generally harder to collect a battery of biomarkers, of biological specimens for the younger children, 6 to 23 months versus 24 to 59 months. So just sort of keeping that in mind as you're thinking through methodologically how you're going to do this. At the same time, it's incredibly costly to say, well, I'll just do a population-based, well, I'll sample the children 6 to 23 months separately from the older children, because that then also, then generates more costs and other issues. So there's no simple answer there. Then the last point I want to make is there definitely is interest on looking at this among adolescents 10 to 19 years. And we've heard a little bit about, looking at the younger children 5 to 14 years as well. I will say, well, I'll get into the adolescents more in the next slides, but it is important to think about adolescent girls and boys separately and not combine them, just because of the different, growth and physiological changes that are happening. They definitely should not be combined. So on the left, again, we see the conceptual framework that we saw in the earlier presentation in the Hess publication. This, clearly applies to our approaches to thinking about modeling anemia predictors. So Impact has provided technical assistance to several national micronutrient surveys that included this etiology of anemia that was built in from the beginning of the survey design. So from day one, people said, okay, we need a national micronutrient survey, but we also need this sub-study built in, where we're able to look at what's the etiology or what are the predictors of anemia in this context. So in this presentation, what I'll do is I'm kind of focusing more on Nepal, because Attica Awas, Dr. Awas, will actually show the results of the Burkina modeling that was done later at the end of today, so that you can see that concrete example. And so both of the Burkina Faso and the Nepal surveys really had a heavy emphasis on including the direct causes of indicators that were nutrition specific, but also non-nutrition specific direct biological causes. I think the other thing to think of is all of the post hoc analysis opportunities. So like you did a survey, you didn't intend to model what are the causes of anemia in this context, but you're like, wow, we actually can do this now. And so we have done this actually for both Nepal and Burkina, where it was not the major focus of the etiology analyses. When those two surveys were done and designed, it was not considered that they would do the modeling for the adolescents. So they didn't necessarily have all of the non-nutrition causes, but they still went ahead and did the analysis with the variables they had. So, and that then showed among the variables you had what was really predicting or correlates of anemia in that context. And we did it both for girls and boys. And we shouldn't just assume that because national migration surveys or assessments aren't done on boys that they don't have deficiencies, because they do. And we'll see that today. But it's also oftentimes they have different issues than you would see in the girls. So it is important, I think, to not forget boys. I guess the other point I would make is just that we also did in Nepal a paper that was published last year along with UNICEF and colleagues in Nepal on an end-lined impact evaluation survey that had over 2,000 children in 2 different districts of Nepal. So one was in the hills and one was in the Terai, which is the plains. And we didn't have some of the infectious indicators and non-nutritional, we didn't have biomarker, we didn't have blood disorders, for example. But we still did that additional secondary analysis because they had a lot of micronutrient indicators. And it was very interesting because I think it really complemented what was done with the National Micronutrient Survey modeling, because you actually saw that there were different predictors in these different settings of the country. The hills are much higher elevation than the plains are. The population density is different. So they actually found that there were different predictors of anemia in these different contexts. So that also just talks about the importance of disaggregation within the country if that's possible. I think the other post hoc analysis to consider that I see a lot of in the literature is people reanalyzing DHS surveys. And you see quite a bit of that in the literature as well. So I guess in general, what I would say is when I look at the literature, what I see a lot more of is sort of these post hoc analyses and much fewer of it like built in from the beginning. But both are feasible and maybe informative. Yeah, in terms of opportunities as well, another analysis that was done just to highlight here is in the Malawi 2015-16 DHS survey, there was like a piggyback linked national micronutrient survey, and that survey also was able to do modeling of the predictors of anemia, as well as looking at it by severity status. So what was predicting mild anemia versus what was predicting moderate or severe anemia. So it's really been focused in different ways. There's different models for doing this, and there's different options. So sorry, I had to scroll down to see that. And then the last point is that in these comprehensive plan surveys, it really did include the collection of a variety of data. So you're looking at from questionnaire data to stool to all kinds of things. So it is quite comprehensive, the biomarkers. Okay, so obviously the outcome is anemia. It needs to be elevation and smoking adjusted and using thresholds that are specific to sex, age, and pregnancy status. Hemoglobinometers can be used to measure hemoglobin in field or lab settings, whereas the automated hematology analyzers really are the preferred method in the WHO guideline, but they're not portable, and really in population-based surveys, it can be very costly and require a lot of additional complex cold chain because it requires whole blood, and to get that to the lab in a timely way that can do the analysis is actually quite challenging and costly. I'm not saying it can't be done depending on the context, but a lot of times it's kind of just like a no-go because it's so complex and costly. Hemoglobin, based on the literature, says that you can keep it cold for 7 days. As of right now, I think some people are questioning that, but that's what the literature says. But even getting a whole blood specimen from a cluster in a remote part of a country to maybe a central lab for analysis within 7 days, could require a helicopter, or it could require motorcycles that have that special charge of just carrying that blood, and that really adds up. So it sounds maybe potentially simple, but in many places it's just not. So I think a first point I want to make before I get into anything about, doing a sub-study, or embedding a sub-study of anemia etiology, is that a population-based national micronutrient status survey, the costs can vary a lot depending on the design, the number of strata, the number of population groups, the number of biomarkers per group, or like other content you're including. And this is all regardless of whether you are building in a comprehensive approach for modeling correlates of anemia. So just as an example, in Guatemala, we've been supporting a nutrition and health surveillance system there since 2011, 2010. And they've done multiple cycles of data collection, where you have an annual estimate. And that surveillance system cycle typically costs $350,000 to $400,000, and you get nationally representative data. In comparison, in Nepal in 2016, their national micronutrient survey, a comprehensive survey, cost almost $3 million. So you're getting many of the same indicators, but the design is different, who's covered, how much disaggregation you have, the number of biomarkers, all of that's different and can have different costs. And the terrain is very different. And the sample sizes were different, and you can go on and on. So this is before you get into any sub-study. So just keep that in mind, okay? So in this example, what you see then is just an example from Nepal of a population-based household survey with a planned comprehensive approach to both the National Micronutrient Survey and including additional direct causes of anemia, for later statistical modeling for predictors of anemia. So there's clearly too many indicators here to really look at closely. If you just look at the left-hand side, I think, yeah, that's left. You can see the groupings, the topics of kind of categories. So it was anthropometry, biomarkers of micronutrient status, of inflammation, of diseases, of blood disorders, dietary variables, reproductive history, among others. And then you can see the red highlight is really the ones that were specifically added, thinking about, well, we want to do some modeling later. What are we missing, in this context? I will say that this then, the modeling was done. I'll include the references at the very end of this presentation in case you actually want to see any of those results. But like now, we're helping Nepal plan the 2025 National Micronutrient Survey. None of those indicators in red are in the objectives, because they're like, well, we already did that. We already know, so now we don't need to do that for our next survey, but we do need to update our prevalence estimates of where we are with these different micronutrient indicators for different population groups. And then just to give some context, in the 2016 survey, this was what the total sample size was for the whole survey, including the anemia modeling sub-study. I will point out, you can see here why it's impossible to do pregnant women with this sample. It's only 107 overall, very, very small. I will say that children 6 to 9 years of age only had urinary iodine concentration, so they couldn't do modeling of anemia. But all the other 4 population groups, there was modeling done. And then these were just the methods that were done, the lab methods. So you can see, and then the ones in red were the ones that were specific for the anemia, the ones that were added in addition to be able to do the anemia modeling. Really the non-micronutrient status tests that otherwise we're not including now for this next round. Okay, and then to give some context of cost, in this example, I didn't write down like which labs we used, like which laboratories did the analysis. Some of these were field tests, some of them were done in laboratories. But you can see at the very bottom, it was approximately $125 for population groups getting all of these tests done. So that would be like the women of reproductive age, for example. I do want to highlight that this ELISA Wittmann lab, if we hadn't used this, it would have added probably $100 to the total. So just, different lab methods have different costs, which is a critical consideration for both the National Micronutrient Survey in general, as well as for modeling. The other thing I want to point out here is that, so like some lab tests are really low cost. So like if we look at like CatoCats, it's less than $1, and it's like, oh, well, that's cheap. We can include that. But you need to think about some of the other costs that then are associated with it. So, maybe that means you're doing stool. Well, maybe that means you actually need to add a day to the cluster to make sure people can give you a stool sample, because not everyone can produce that on demand. You might need to hire an extra lab person who specifically is just reading the Cato cats, so there might be other costs built in that aren't related directly to the lab cost itself that you need to consider. Now, if you were planning to be in a cluster for 3 or 4 days anyway, and this is a sub-study, well then, maybe it doesn't add cost too much, but it might. So these are just some of the considerations to keep in mind. And then in the photo, you can see, there's portable freezers, there's the centrifuges on the floor, there's generators, there's cold boxes, there's a lot of stuff you need to do these kinds of surveys that then need to be processed, pretty closely after data collection. The other thing I wanted to mention was that, at least in the surveys where we provide technical assistance, we always try to make sure we have backup specimens stored securely in the country, whether the labs are done domestically or if they're sent to international labs. And this is in case, for some reason, the labs need to be repeated. And then, however, once those labs are complete and the results are finalized and everything's sent out, you then potentially, this is where you have some of those post hoc opportunities or additional opportunities, you could potentially take those stored biospecimens then after everything's done and do other analyses. So go back and do, vitamin D, or go back and do something else. Now it depends on what nutrient biomarker you want to do and what the matrix is and what the lab assay methods are and other things, but it does add some potential to get additional analyses later. So things related to analysis, some of the key things I wanted to point out was that laboratory analysis, whether it's done in country or out of country, can take a long time to complete. This is really important for policymakers, for communication to everyone involved, especially in country, because it's not unusual for people to be complaining and saying, you did this survey 6 months ago, how come you don't have a report yet? You're not doing a good job. And it's like, well, actually, that's an unreasonable expectation that you would expect to have all of these labs done because it just takes longer. It's a lot of samples, it's a lot of throughput. It really depends on how the lab is set up, how many people they have analyzing, what the method is, how long it takes to run it. I mean, there's many factors that need to be considered for this. So I think communicating that from the start is really important, whether it's for an etiology analysis or just a national micronutrient survey, but especially then for an etiology analysis, because if you're going to do it, you need all of the biomarkers. You need all of the results. You're not going to run it just with 3 of them and then say, well, later on we'll do it again once we have the full set. So this is, I think, something that's really, from a communication standpoint, is really important, and make sure people really understand that from the beginning. We already mentioned that it's cross-sectional data, so it's not causal. So you're modeling like predictors or correlates of anemia, and it's not, you cannot say it's causal. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. The other thing is that you have to have, like I just mentioned, you have to have all the biomarkers. So that might mean that your survey report shows this many people, had the different results for different micronutrients or different biomarkers, but then your analytic sample for modeling might actually be lower. And so in this example, it was several hundred people lower for the children and for the women in reproductive age because everyone had to have all the biomarkers. So just keeping that in mind as well, those kind of things can happen. Yeah, I mean, I've been talking about a lot of things that make it sound challenging, and it is, but if you're already planning a national micronutrient survey or some kind of comprehensive assessment, it can be complex to include, and it can be costly depending on how you do it, but it's also very feasible. And we've done this in many, many places. And it just takes, it's doable with planning and working with those experienced in doing biomarker assessment and cold chain management and these analyses. So, I mean, I don't want to be overwhelming in terms of saying everything that's hard about it, but I want to be practical, but at the same time say you can talk to a lot of people who've been able to do it. So as we mentioned, in this case, from a total cost perspective, the total cost was around, a little less than $3 million. I wanted to point out that CDC did do the statistical modeling of correlates analysis for the 4 population groups in kind and wrote those papers, so that's not reflected in these costs. And like I said, in the Nepal case, they actually had all of the funding up front, including the sub-study for etiology of anemia. And in some other cases, that's also been the case, like with Burkina. But in other contexts, you might have a survey that's allowed to go forward with training and field work, even though maybe they only have, 80 or 70 or 90% of the total funding needed. Like maybe they don't have all the money for all the lab analyses afterwards. So that's just a practical thing to keep in mind, that you might need to then be continuing to do fundraising, continuing to find funds to get all of the lab analyses done to then do the modeling later. So all of these can also then have an effect on the timeline for finishing the work. Yeah, and like I already said, I mean, the survey costs might seem high, but the results will inform policies and programs to make them more effective and impactful. It'll identify needed multisectoral actions and ultimately contribute to reducing anemia to achieve both the national and the global targets. So if you have questions, you can follow up with me. Oh, I didn't change the thing, hold on. And then these are the 4 publications I mentioned earlier that have been published in various journals. You can read those if you're interested and see all the different correlates and how it varied even in one country. And thank you.